What is the complex role between shame and addiction? When does shame hurt and when does it harm? And what does it mean to conceive addicts as responsible but not blameworthy? These are some of the questions that I asked the philosopher Owen Flanagan, author of the book, What Is It Like to Be an Addict? This is a thought-provoking and humane conversation, one that I'm sure that you will learn from and enjoy. I'm Aisha Cherry. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, the author of such books as The Case for Rage and Failures of Forgiveness, and your guide through the messy yet beautiful world of human emotions. Let's get into it. So just a brief bio on Owen. Owen Flanagan is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Neurobiology Emeritus at Duke University. He's the author of 13 books on the nature of consciousness, the self, the relation of psychology to neuroscience, the emotions, as well as addiction and cross-cultural ethics. So I must add that he's also the co-editor of The Moral Psychology of Anger, a book that he and I co-edited together, I think around 2018, Owen. And it was through the series editor that Owen and I first met and decided to work together. So just wanted to add that to the bio. Flanagan has recently held research fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Science at Stanford University and the National Humanities Center. And he is currently a visiting professor of philosophy at NYU Abu Dhabi. So Owen and I is going to be in conversation for about 30 minutes or so. And then what we'll do, we'll spend the second half of our hour in conversation with the audience. All right, so let's get started. So the first question I want to ask you, Owen, is why did you, Owen Flanagan, the scholar and the human being, write a book about addiction? And why did you write that book now?
Okay, yeah, two different, yeah, good. Yeah. So, first of all, since you read the book, first half of the book, people know. So I was an addict myself. I was an alcoholic on and off for over 20 years. And I also had a fondness for benzodiazepines, which are considered, I mean, maybe we'll talk about this, they're considered an addictive drug too. And I abused those as well the whole time. I was addicted to booze. And it was bad. Both my addiction was bad, the social interpersonal consequences of it were bad, effects on my health were bad, effects on my self-esteem and self-respect were bad, disappointment of others in me, disappointment in myself, these were all terrible. And I, for a long time, by the end, I didn't know if I could get out of it. I wasn't quite a resigned addict, but I was close to wanting to die. Sometimes I would have the thought that, but wait, if I die, I can't drink and I have to drink. And it was just, I was pretty, it was bad. But I did, with the help of friends who were actually in Alcoholics Anonymous, because I know we'll talk about that a little bit. I did, after many, many attempts, finally get sober. But there were 5 hospitalizations. There were 2 long stints in rehab. And the long stints in rehab were only made possible because I had good insurance and things like that. So I got lucky as well. There were just social and economic supports that I had that gave me several different attempts and good medical care. And again, friends in Alcoholics Anonymous. So I did get sober. And so that was soon after I got sober, I was invited back to give a talk to the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, which I had been president of about 10 years before that. And the talk that I gave was called What It's Like to Be an Addict, which is, for people who know, Thomas Nagel, philosopher of mind, has a famous paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat, where he tries to tell the story of what it's like of a bat from the subjective point of view, from the first personal point of view. And Nagel's overall view in that paper is that, you know, all the objective sort of science about bat brains, sound detection of bats, how they catch mosquitoes, whatever we can know from the external point of view won't be sufficient to tell us about the inner life of bats. And so I kind of thought, both then, I saw my audience wake up and listen. Some of them were sort of, a few knew about my struggles, but a lot didn't know. that's one of the things about being an addict or an alcoholic. You can sometimes keep it secret, not from everyone. It's impossible to keep it from everyone. But I was pretty professionally successful as a philosopher. So people said, "Well, it's impossible that you could have done all this stuff and be really have a problem." And I said, "No, it's quite easy." And people out there. I mean, 16.5% of Americans have at some time or other a substance addiction, just a substance addiction. We're not talking about, gambling addictions and whatever other kinds of addictions there are. But so I felt that given my work in sort of on the nature of consciousness, on the importance of the subjective point of view, that the fact that I was appointed in neurobiology and psychology, I was kind of uniquely positioned to speak in an integrative way about addiction. And so I had started to be asked to write some articles about it, and I had about a half dozen articles. So when I retired fully from Duke, I decided to write the book. The timing was probably, it was also that I was ambivalent about the exposure, just because there's exposure and people talk, and I understand that. And I didn't, but I feel good about it. I feel that I feel like I did the right thing. And if the book is helpful to addicts and helpful to theorists about addiction, then I'm happy and proud of it. And so I'm on 19 years of not using drugs or alcohol. And so that's where I came from in writing the book now. Yeah.
So our conversation is going to be about shame and addiction. So let's first start with addiction. So how do you, I guess you could say, describe addiction, or what is addiction on your view? And
Yeah.
how does that view differ from accounts from AA, for example, or even other disciplinary fields?
Good. So yeah. So let me just take two sort of views of addiction. One will be the AA one maybe, and then one can be. So in 1997, head of the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Drug Addiction, wrote a famous paper called "Addiction is a Brain Disease and It Matters." And so what happened then was that we saw the emergence of something called the dopamine, what I call the universal dopamine hypothesis. And the idea there was that just as cancer is a disease and so on and so forth, diabetes is a disease, coronary artery is a disease, so too there is a disease called addiction, and it actually is located in the brain, and it involves the dopamine system. And I knew from my work in neurobiology that this is peculiar because, well, first of all, not just neurobiology. It seemed, I knew, for example, that all different drugs affect different neural systems. And there's over 100 neurotransmitters and so on and so forth. And we don't know, for example, amphetamines and things like cocaine and stimulants, basically, they do seem to involve surges in the dopaminergic system. But a lot of other drugs, like alcohol, only involves the dopamine system slightly, and alcohol is the most abused drug. Things like, if you think that people can be addicted to marijuana, that doesn't involve much of the dopamine system at all. It involves cannabinoid receptors. So as you look through different drugs that people claim to be addicted to, you see that actually they're met by the brain and the body. Of course, they're involved with metabolism is hugely involved. So it isn't just the brain. It's like, we take these in through our mouths, through our veins, through our throat, and these get broken down in various ways. But the first thing out of the gate I knew was that eventually I came to, reading the neuroscience carefully, that look at the whole brain is involved. There's at least 18 different areas of the brain that are involved in various aspects of addiction. There are many, many neurochemicals involved, and they vary drug by drug. So my first view was that, well, depending on which drug you're taking, different aspects of the body and brain are activated. So that was just the first thing out of. And then when you look at the causes of addiction, so if it's a disease, it's not entirely a brain disease. And then we look at the causes of addiction and we see things like social dislocation, We see some things like people self-medicating for anxiety disorders. Full 50% of people with substance addictions have other psychiatric disorders, if we want to call them that, like anxiety or mood disorders. I certainly knew my first drink made me feel calm in a way that I'd never been calm before. And I thought, I registered that. Boy, I thought this is kind of good. And then there are so my general view is that I prefer to call addiction a disorder. It's clearly a behavioral disorder. It's not just in the brain. You got to do stuff in the world. So the first point was I just thought this is a really heterogeneous, biochemically, neurologically heterogeneous set of disorders, if it's a brain disorder at all. And I mean, if it has brain components, clearly, because we're embodied and we have brains. But I don't think it's a simple disease. And then switching to the AA model, I mean, if one goes to AA meetings and the disease talk comes up, and it does, because people do buy into a cultural narrative that says addiction is a disease, it usually is compared to type 2 diabetes, not type 1 diabetes. And I think that's important, not because the analogy is perfect, but because type 2 diabetes is thought to be partly under the control of the agent herself, that by changing diet, for example, and exercise, one can start to take control of type 2 diabetes, which is considered more of a developmental disorder than it is thought to be a disease you just catch or get, like a pancreatic cancer, say, something like that. So that's sort of on the disease model. And by the way, I should say that one of the unfortunate aspects of the brain disease model is that it led everybody to focus on, as I say, the dopaminergic system. There hasn't been one drug created since that theme came out, that it's a brain disease and it's a dopaminergic disease. Not one drug has been created to affect the dopaminergic system in any way that is helpful to any addict. Not one. There's not even any in development. So it's a problem with the sort of rhetoric of science and the proprietary attitude that neuroscience decided to take towards the phenomenon, not about the nature of the phenomenon. The nature of the phenomenon is clearly psychosocial, neurological, behavioral. As far as AA, the AA was very helpful to me, and it's actually at least as helpful, it looks like the data are in, as almost all other modes of getting better for Americans. I mean, and that may have to do with the fact that we have roots in sort of Christian Abrahamic religions that make us feel safe in something which mentions God so much. Nonetheless, in the opening of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, Dr. Silkworth says it is a disease. It's a chronic disease. Some people think that in the outside of AA. And he says it's akin to an allergy. And that's peculiar because to me, it's the opposite of an allergy. Allergy things I want to stay away from because they make my throat close up and sneeze. Alcohol is something I want. In any case, the other thing about AA, which is the insistence, and this is more in the rest of the book, where disease is never mentioned again, actually, only in the preface. It clearly is but the disease model wins there too. But the recipe in AA is some kind of fundamental, complete psychic transformation, some kind of spiritual transformation. And in the book, we get discussions of both William James, who said, and Carl Gustav Jung, both of whom said they'd never seen anybody recover from alcoholism unless they had some kind of psychic and spiritual change. And that's not something that I buy in. I think often the good news is that an addiction is sometimes isolated from the rest of a person's personality. Sometimes it is absorbing and identity constitutive, but sometimes it's the problem. And if you help unseat the problem, the psychobiological behavioral problem, the person can return to who they were before and go on with things without a psychic transformation that involves something like a religious conversion. So those are the areas in which I disagree with those two models.
So you call your account, in addition to your description, call it kind of an integrative kind of thinking. And I'm gonna quote you here, because as I often note, philosophers seem to be kind of obsessed with the nature of a thing. But I was touched by the end of your book, and and this is what you say at the end of the book. It says, integrative thinking, humane values, and nuanced thinking about the nature and ethics of addiction are the order of the day. Take very seriously the responsibility that comes with the opportunity to write about addiction. And you end that paragraph by saying, quote, I hope what I've had to say is helpful, end quote. So my question is, why and how is knowing what addiction is practically helpful?
Well, good. So the first part is interesting because, yeah, on the one hand, my view is that addiction isn't a simple thing. So knowing what it is in one way knowing a lot about what it isn't. So it's not a singular thingamajig. And I actually really do think it's quite important for people to separate out addictions by which substance you're addicted to. And I only am writing about substance addictions, but there are, of course, behavioral addictions, which I think probably deserve the name addictions too. But I think they're heterogeneous phenomena, and we need to take them one by one. And in different people's cases, I mean, sometimes, for example, if a person is self-medicating because of a anxiety disorder, that's common enough, and they get hooked, as we say, they've learned new behavior. That's a different kind of problem where we need to be very attentive to what they call the comorbidity, in this case, the anxiety disorder. It may be by the time a person has, an addiction, but we also need to treat the anxiety disorder. So sometimes the anxiety disorder is primary. Of course, for people whose lives are just terrible because of social dislocation or racism or being impoverished, sometimes drugs start out as the main and only thing that gives them solace and pleasure. And those are different kinds of cases because the etiology is different. And I think so the overall view is just really that unless we think clearly and carefully about the all these aspects of addiction, we're just not going to have sort of humane ways as a culture of approaching them. And the other thing is that as far as the nature goes, I do think we live in a time in which back to the disease model for a minute, it led to, and this will get us into the shame thing relatively straightforwardly. We live in a time where just so many people, especially, I mean, and people of goodwill will say, well, thank God we all agree that there's a disease here, because the disease means that the addict isn't responsible for her actions. And if you're not responsible for your actions, you shouldn't feel shame or guilt about them. And the rest of us shouldn't be disdainful or disappointed in the addict. And it's just sort of a bunch of logical dominoes are alleged to fall. And there, I just say, whoa, 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 back up, because it just isn't that simple. First of all, as I've already said, if it is a disease, if you want to use that terminology, and it's not going to kill me if you say it's a disease, it's not the kind of disease for which we think the agent isn't responsible. And no addicts I know think they're not responsible. Even the ones who say in rooms, I have a disease called addiction. They don't say they're not responsible. They're just trying to leverage and get help with leveraging the place in which they can unseat this complicated problem that they have. So it's really as much as getting rid of the idea that it has a simple nature as a neurological disorder, for example, specifically one of the dopamine system or whatever. It's just not. So displacing that idea and then being aware of the different ways in which addiction can be, as I say, it can be sometimes identity constitutive. I mean, I kind of thought we Flanagans are supposed to be drinkers. I was raised thinking that, good Irish Catholic boy. So I was introduced to a form of life which seemed innocent enough, happy making, fun, but it got out of control. But it was identity constitutive for me. For other people, they get addicted and there's nothing about their form of life which makes it something they're sort of authorized to do. I mean, I met I met a really good basketball player at Duke years ago from East St. Louis, and he told me, he said, the first time I smoked crack on the basketball court, I just coughed so much I never went back. But he said, none of my friends who were better than me, they didn't get out. And so sometimes there's just these social opportunities that happen, and you luck out by, having an allergy attack or whatever he had. And so these are all entirely different kind of cases, I think. But, and by the way, throughout the whole book, I use the word addiction. We've been using it today, and I use alcoholism. And again, people say, well, now that we learned that there's a disease here, that people aren't responsible for diseases, and we shouldn't be disappointed in people, like we don't get disappointed in people who have pancreatic cancer, then we shouldn't use this certain kind of language because it's stigmatizing. And then again, you get back. In fact, there's a funny document by the Surgeon General, maybe one or two Surgeon Generals ago. He was a great guy. I remember, I can picture him. But the title of the document is Addiction in America. And then the first paragraph in, he says, we no longer use the word addiction. We now use the word substance abuse. And then 30 pages later, because addiction was found stigmatizing. Then he says, we use now substance abuse. Then 30 pages later, he says, we no longer use substance abuse, we use substance misuse, because substance abuse was considered stigmatizing. And you can just see this never ends. And the fact that addicts will appropriate the way gay people appropriate the concepts of gay or whatever, the concept, they say, I'm an addict or an alcoholic, I think is telling, and that we don't need to be so it isn't like a bunch of dominoes that just once you hit upon the disease description, everything else that makes addicts feel bad about themselves or makes us feel disappointed in addicts falls away. It's just not like that. Practically, it's not like that. And I think humane values suggest it shouldn't be like that because there's some control that addicts have.
So let's talk about some of those attitudes and emotions that you mentioned. That is shame, disappointment, denial,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. What does the literature on shame get wrong about shame in your view, and thus what they get wrong about shame and addiction?
I got interested in shame a while ago for a different reason than having to do with addiction. I was interested in the fact, because I was teaching a lot of cross-cultural ethics, and I noticed that in let's just take sort of Confucianism or Buddhism, both those traditions are traditions in which shame plays an important sort of socializing role in children. People who are listening to this can't tell, but Maisha is being attacked by a hornet or a bee or a mosquito or something like that.
I'm fighting for my life over here. But going on, I'm paying attention.
She's swatting. She's swatting. Anyway, so I realized, I thought, this is interesting because shame is thought in sort of Western, what we call in psychology, they call them weird cultures, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures, which are fairly unrepresentative. Shame is thought to be a really problematic emotion. And the usual view is that shame is totalizing, and that a person, when they feel ashamed, feels something like, I am a global failure. I am just an unworthy piece of shit. I'm an unworthy human being. So it's often thought to ascribe negativity to the global self. That is the way usually it's put. But when I read about, ethics, for example, in Buddhism or Hinduism or Confucianism, you just see that shame is just thought to be the emotion where one feels, as it were, learns to feel bad about having a certain disposition. So when, for example, your mother says to you, Owen, you should not take the blocks from your sister Virginia, which in fact my mother probably did say to me, but learn to play with your sister Virginia. You should be ashamed of yourself. She wasn't inviting me to feel bad about myself globally as a human being. She was just inviting me to feel negatively about the disposition to hoard blocks for my sister. And the more I looked into, so I did some work looking at the origins of this negative view of shame in Western culture, and It goes back fairly recently to an important psychoanalyst named Helen Lewis, New York psychoanalyst, who she dealt with people who were women mostly, who had been physically abused or sexually abused or both, who did have extraordinary problems with feeling shame or awful about their global selves. Um, and um, and that led then to measurement tools in America. There's a test called TOSCA, Test for Self-Conscious Emotions. And that test does things like this. It says, it gives questions such as this. If you didn't study for an exam and you took the exam and you failed it, what do you think about yourself? And one answer is, I think I should have studied more. And that's called the guilt response. So guilt is okay. But if you think I'm a worthless, dumb human being, that's the shame response. And so the shame response is just already a shame response that is global. It's never measured. It can't be localized into just about it. You know, you might say, well, what about if I have the disposition not to study enough? And then you say, well, you shouldn't, you can feel shame. If you feel anything bad about that, what you have is guilt, not shame. Anyway, it's very confused and it just doesn't line up with what any people in every other culture thinks. Every culture agrees you shouldn't feel global shame, but almost every culture thinks feeling shame about either dispositions you have, like a disposition to drink too much, say, or feeling ashamed about behavior like stealing from other people's bank accounts, are things that you appropriately feel shame for. Usually the distinction between shame and guilt goes like this. When people make it, although North Americans don't, when they do semantic tests, make a distinction. We tend to use shame and guilt the same way. The usual view is that you should feel guilty for actions. Like, so if you did take a block from your sister, you should feel guilty for that. If you have a disposition to take blocks and not play nicely with your sister, you should feel ashamed for that. That would be so the idea the shame attaches to a disposition, the guilt attaches to an act. And the usual view is that guilt is anger turned inward, and that shame is something like sadness and anxiety and fear about a disposition. So the first point just is there's no reason to think that shame always comes in the extreme form. And just the fact that it feels negatively doesn't mean it doesn't have uses, social uses, moral uses, and so on. So that's the first move to make.
So the follow-up would be this: why would an addict feel shame? And what could be good about that?
Okay, so it's not as if I think that it's not as if I think that shame can't be really bad and guilt can be really bad. All these emotions, because guilt can lead to self-flagellation, which can be immobilizing. So you know so the first thing we need to sort of think, there are a lot of emotions which feel bad. In fact, if you just think about the basic emotions, most of them, you know, if you say anger, fear, sadness, those are three negative emotions, but we think they're just part of the human repertoire, and we will feel them at certain points in life, and they're functional. I don't want to just say evolutionarily functional, but if we're hiking and we see the snake, then fear is an appropriate response. It leads us to do something positive. If we are being downgraded because of, for whatever reason, not treated as worthy as a human being, then as you and I both know, righteous anger, indignation is appropriate and should be expressed. So so emotions that feel bad are not bad just because they feel that way, because their valence is negative. They can be bad for both. They can be bad. Both anger and fear can be bad if they're excessive. Now, I think the same thing about shame and guilt, that they're actually emotions which, when a sort of a moral community or a social community has them pegged right, will call a person's attention to things that, in the case of shame or guilt, things that she herself doesn't approve of. So it actually is sort of just a general norm in culture that is better for everyone if you don't get addicted to a substance. Things will go better for you. Your life will go better for you. And most addicts grow up believing that too. Almost all addicts would say, I would prefer to take a shitload of my drug, but not be an addict. So I had complete control over when and where I take it. So it isn't that. So I think that shame and guilt, these negative emotions, can give us signs of where we're overstepping even the bounds of our own norms and the things we believe in. And they help us locate zones of life where there's appropriate disapproval of how we're living. I mean, when I was an addict and letting down my family, when I was being unfaithful to my wife, when I was being just thoughtless and inconsiderate, when I was spending way too much money. I mean, these are all things that I feel guilty and ashamed of. And thank God I did in some way, because I think they kept wanting me to come back, making me want to come back to get help. Maybe want to go back to see psychiatrists, maybe want to go back to AA. It wasn't just the problem I had with my drug of choice. It was all the other ways in which it percolated out into a life that I wasn't proud of. And so appropriate shame and guilt, I think, can play a role. And it's silly to go from the point of it's a disease. You would be silly to have shame and guilt over pancreatic cancer. I say, yes, you would be silly to have shame and guilt over pancreatic cancer, but this isn't that kind of disease, if it's a disease at all. It's something where the agent really eventually does have to assert control again and has to find a way.
So we've been talking about shame, particularly shame in the context of an addict. I want to switch to kind of other attitudes of loved ones,
Yep.
for example. So when is our disdain, disappointment, and disapproval of our loved ones' addiction warranted?
You would expect this of me. I don't have any general sort of rule or algorithm for that. But I think that, for the same reasons the addict can feel, there's the kind of symmetry here. If the addict feels ashamed that they can't work their way out of, using their drug of choice to the degree that they're using it, if their behavior is caused by the drug, sometimes we're focused on the addiction, sometimes we're focused on the things that accompany the addiction, like needing more money than you should be spending because your family needs the money for food and clothing and shelter. But other times it's the addiction itself which is causing the problem, because the person just leaves the earth when they shoot up or when they get drunk or whatever. But I think there is some kind of symmetry. I think it would be peculiar to think that the family who's being affected, or the friends or the loved ones, aren't going to feel some kind of disappointment, disdain, and worry about the other person. I think it's a lot easier, of course, for professionals to take a completely what you might call objective attitude towards an addict, namely say, well, I'm treating you, I'm going to help you get, both, maybe I'll help you with some drugs that will get you off, overcome the craving for your opioid, or I'm going to help you get into a rehab where you get therapy. I'm going to help you get to AA meetings where you're going to leverage your responsibility back there, and not take personally the fact that you're causing disruption in life. I think it's quite appropriate and it happens all the time, that the loved ones of addicts have to walk away, and sometimes permanently, because there's too much interpersonal damage, and that's one of the tragedies of addiction. But I guess for the same reasons, I don't think we should take shame and guilt off the table as first personal attitudes. We shouldn't take these other attitudes of, it isn't like there's a mistake being made by your loved ones in being disappointed in you for being an addict. That doesn't mean they think that you're not in some kind of control, but they get that you're having trouble leveraging the control, and that a lot of addicts do. I mean, that's where the base rates matter. If 50% of addicts just don't ever get out of their addiction, which rates may be that high, then there must be very powerful causal forces all around us, in our bodies, but around our bodies, that keep addicts in that state. So it isn't like a simple thing. But back to the diabetes, the type 2 diabetes, where you have to do a lot of things yourself to get better for this. And it's not always clear. It's not as clear as in the case of type 2 diabetes, what exactly you can do. Diet and exercise alone aren't going to do it.